Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bonnie McClafferty. I'm the Director of Agriculture and Nutrition at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, and I'm delighted to be here today with my esteemed panel members on what is a very timely topic. I would like to be very tight with time here, and Jomo, thank you so much for that introduction. I think it really set the tone of the challenge we still have remaining ahead. Some very concrete commitments that came out of the ICN, which I think were quite extensive and were multi-sectoral and crossed a gamut of actors. The way we would like to start this panel discussion is to kind of begin with, I'll give a brief introduction to my panelists, that would be good. Sitting to my left is Richard Green. I think many of us know Richard Green. Richard is the Deputy Assistant Administrator at the Bureau of Food Security, but my connection with Richard goes back to the days in Bangladesh, where Richard was really spearheading a lot of the good work in public health, nutrition, and then agriculture as the Feed the Future initiative came into being. Richard was very instrumental, I think, in really pushing what was innovation that had to come when you start linking agriculture with nutrition, but very much with the public health lens, and that's I think our first encounter, Richard. To his left, Lucy Sullivan. Those who don't know Lucy, Lucy is the Executive Director of the 1,000-Day Initiative, and I think a critical member here on the panel because Lucy brings advocacy. And I think, Lucy, why this is very important is, you know, evidence is a good part and critical in decision-making, particularly in policy shift, but it's often not enough. The political process comes into place. There's a lot we need to do beyond evidence. And so it's great to have you here. Rolf Clem comes to us initially, he's now with HKI, Helen Keller International, which is arguably one of the NGOs that really puts food at the center of nutrition. Rolf comes as having spent many years as a card-carrying nutritionist on the panel, coming from Johns Hopkins University, and I think Rolf will really, where's that card, Rolf? I think that Rolf will really lend a real sort of truth test to what is actually possible in nutrition, and particularly around issues of measurement and attribution. And Jomo, of course, needs no introduction. Thank you very much. I'd like to start the panel with a kind of what might be called a soft question, a warm-up question, and that has to do precisely with the outcomes of the ICN2. In truth, in full disclosure, I did not attend the ICN2, but I was a member of some of the preparatory meetings. And so I'm as much an audience member here as I am a moderator. And I would like everyone to address, and just for 2 minutes, because we are tight on time, the ICN2 wanted to be a starting point for the renewed effort to improve nutrition for all. And so what were some of your big takeaways? Or if you weren't there, what is some of what you're reading and some of the documentation that's coming out? What are some of the big takeaways from your perspective in your organizations? Richard.
Thanks. For me, there were three major ones. One is, again, the importance of strong leadership at the country level, but not just to have the Prime Minister chair a nutrition committee. The leadership has to devolve down to regional, district, health center, and community level. And so leadership was a big deal. Who leads it, who's in charge of implementation, who tracks it at all the levels. Second, that nutrition is a real multi-sectoral effort, and the USAID multi-sectoral nutrition strategy, as well as the US government nutrition coordination plan that we're working on now, are very, very important to promoting this multi-sectoral collaboration, which includes the private sector, which is going to be a key part of any multi-sectoral response. Finally, empowering people, mothers, to take charge of their own nutrition, like they're doing in developing countries on immunization. All mothers know their immunization status of their child. Right now, we don't have that level of personal accountability on nutrition.
So I think the ICN2 was successful in promoting very much a food systems approach. The political declaration and the framework for action were actually very good documents that recognize and put forward this notion that the common denominator to all forms of malnutrition, whether we're talking about micronutrient deficiency, obesity, overweight, or undernutrition, is a diet that is nutritionally poor. So this focus on diets and this focus on policy and the role of policy in promoting better diets. Now, the downside of those documents are, of course, that they're voluntary. So the governments that came to ICN2 formally adopted the political declaration and the framework for action, but it remains to be seen what levels of commitments now governments are actually going to make and what actions they're going to take in terms of the policy recommendations that were put forward to actually drive the change that we want to see, improvements in diets.
Good, Ralph.
Well, also in fair disclosure, I was not present at ICN2. I was at ICN1 with more hair and less of a paunch at the time. So I'm sort of have paid attention to some of the noise that's been generated around it. And I think the first thing, because HKI was involved with the civil society, was it brought together an extraordinary spectrum of groups across ideologies, political ideologies, economic ideologies, which was really good for a common goal. How to achieve that goal, there were some pretty fractious arguments about things, which is very difficult to do when you're dealing with ideologies, which I think is unfortunate, but that was the reality. The second was, and I think this is a turning point, that I think there's now universal agreement that the malnutrition has complex and multiple causes. And I'm reminded of the wisdom of actually a guy from Baltimore. I'm from Baltimore, an American journalist, H.L. Mencken, who said, for every complex problem, there is an answer that's clear, that's simple, and wrong. And so I think I do think the ICN2 has signaled a broad recognition of the complexity of the multiple solutions at multiple levels and multiple sectors that are needed. And the third, and it's more of a question, is this a game-changing meeting, or is it, business as usual mindset? And I think that's the question out there. In my mind, two things will determine that. One is the support to countries to build the capacity while also, in tandem, holding them accountable. And I think those need to come together. And I guess my final comment is, I don't know why it took 22 years to get the second ICN, and I hope it doesn't take another 22 years to get the third ICN. It would really be nice to see one in 5 or 10 years where we can begin to look at both the support as well as the accountability.
But you commit to being at ICN3.
Yeah, with even less hair and hopefully not as much of a paunch.
Jomo, thank you. And I think it would be great to take on this question of, the impact side of this as we go forward. What's next? How much is this relating to action and it's going to go forward in terms of action?
In trying to make my remarks, my original remarks very brief, I did not mention many of the processes which went into ICN2. Just for example, in the 2 days preceding the conference, there were 4 other meetings which were very important. There was a meeting of the Sun Movement. We had coordinated with the Sun Movement to have the meetings just before the ICN2. Meetings of civil society, Lucy was very active in that. The third meeting was with the private sector, and the fourth meeting was with parliamentarians. And I want to mention parliamentarians in particular because the rest are all fairly predictable. But to get enabling legislation at the national level, mobilizing parliamentarians is extremely important, and this especially in democratic societies. And this is especially important because in most countries in the world, you do not have any single peak agency responsible for nutrition. Nutrition falls between many stools, and so this becomes extremely important. And that's part of the reason why, in particular institutions I've been visiting in Washington, I've been meeting different parts of those institutions, precisely recognizing that there are many different people who need to be mobilized in order to make malnutrition history.
I think that's a great segue back over to Lucy. Lucy runs one of the largest advocacy organizations around the 1,000 Days. So Lucy, this whole idea of mobilization and advocacy And tell us a little bit about some of what you did in preparation for the ICN, but what do you think is still needed if we're to get the parliamentarians to go beyond curiosity in this issue, but actually get to the point of legislation and policy making? What needs to happen?
Yeah, so yes, 1,000 Days, we are a large force, but it's only because of our partners. So we have, over 80 partners that are all dedicated to ensuring that there's greater action and investment in maternal and child nutrition. So we're not doing it alone, certainly. So in terms of what's needed, the parliamentarians, that's actually a really interesting addition to this equation, because ICN2 is very much about talking about policies that need to be implemented at country level to drive the kind of change that we all want to see in terms of improvements in nutritional status. Parliamentarians, of course, need to get elected, and so yes, there's a huge political dimension to that. And in terms of what's needed, certainly stronger policies that are food policies, for example, that are actually aligning with health policies. So that's or the kind of health outcomes that we want to see. And so that takes political courage. I mean, certainly looking at sort of what's going on in the United States, it takes political courage to stand up and to advocate as a member of Congress or even a local official to advocate for things like a tax on sodas. The other thing that's required is money, quite frankly. So we know still that less than 1% of official development assistance goes to nutrition. Less than 1% to deal with a problem that causes about 45% of all child deaths. I mean, there's a huge imbalance there in terms of the resources that are dedicated to nutrition, and of course not just donor money, but also what countries themselves are spending on ensuring that their populations, especially the most vulnerable, the poorest, mothers and children, actually have the right nutrition. So I think we need to have serious conversations about the money equation.
Now go over to Richard. Richard, in the USAID multi-sectoral nutrition strategy, I think you folks have really taken on this whole idea of nutrition-specific and nutrition-sensitive interventions. And I know those of us that have tried to work across sectors very much welcome this category of what is a sensitive intervention, but it's quite the challenge for us to try to really get to the point of attribution of sensitive interventions towards nutrition. And we struggle with us. But if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about these nutrition-sensitive interventions, are we ready to program and invest around the sensitive interventions? What else is needed in the global research agenda and programming to make nutrition-sensitive ready for us to be using it quite extensively? And do we know, or do we know what the impact will be, and how we go ahead and measure that? And Rolf, I probably will turn to you too, because these measuring of nutrition sensitivity versus specific interventions is something I think you're probably grappling with too at HKI.
I have to be frank, when I first heard about and thought about nutrition-sensitive interventions, I didn't like it at all, because what I feared and what started to happen was that everything, all food programs, all women's programs, all basic education programs could automatically be classified as nutrition sensitive. And thus, you could make the case we're spending billions and billions on nutrition activities. Well, these are the sensitive side and the specific side. Well, why would you need any more money to do any of this? Sorry, Lucy. But so because of that, we did a lot of thinking about what really constitutes a nutrition-sensitive intervention. So we recently had a webinar where we came up throughout 5 ideas of, okay, if you meet these 5, then we can classify your horticulture, aquaculture, livestock, or legume program from the ag side as being nutrition-sensitive. And one of the things was, choosing a crop or a product that is a nutrient gap in where you work. Something simple like that. Number 2, you need to have, no matter what if you're working for those areas, you need to have a behavior change communication approach, because you're dealing with women, it's a missed opportunity, and you got to link it to the nutrition-specific interventions, and there are people out there that have already developed these in your countries. 3, you need to monitor consumption, and I like to say in Bangladesh we had a HORT program, and and we measure consumption, which is the good news, and they doubled consumption, but the bad news was doubling of nothing is still nothing, but at least you're making a commitment to monitor it, and if you monitor it, it will happen. So we are now moving forward with this with a lot of comments from a lot of people in the community, and we're going to try to narrow this down so we have less money on nutrition-sensitive intervention, but we really have nutrition-sensitive programs.
Yeah, so a couple of comments. I think we all recognize that agriculture is absolutely vital for food security and nutrition in theory. I think there's a lot of plausible pathways, but those are complex, and I think they're also very context specific. I also think sometimes what we look at in terms of measuring nutritional status and the expectations that we have, we expect changes in indicators that are not very responsive to most things. Linear growth is not very responsible to, in most cases, to any one intervention, because it's an accumulation of stresses that began in fetal life. So to expect agriculture by itself or in some combination with other interventions to make dramatic changes, I think is setting up, well, it's using the wrong indicator. We need to find those things that are more responsive. And what are the kinds of things that are responsive to agricultural interventions? There are some clear ones, things related to diet. Yet we still know very little about dietary intakes. We have very poor dietary intake data. We know that we don't have that much great data about production, many of the estimates, and how that production is processed and distributed. Because I think many of, even some of the comments made earlier about the impressive gains that we've made, they've been made in a few places that have large populations. But those of us who work in marginalized communities, things have not shifted particularly well, and sometimes markets don't reach there. And so I think context is really critical. And for me, I think the most important thing is to capture indicators that are most likely, that agriculture is most likely to influence. If income is not increasing, if prices are not decreasing, if diet is not changing, it seems to me that if you see a change in nutritional status, it's probably spurious because something else changed. And I think one has to be careful in the selection of indicators. I think it's a lot to ask for agriculture alone. And I'd just like to echo a couple of things that you said, Richard, that how women make purchasing decisions, and HK is involved with a number of homestead food production and small animal raising. And the question is, do people eat what they consume what they grow, or do they sell it? And how, when they sell it, how do they make those choices? And I think we still have a lot to learn in that area.
Bonnie, can I start a food fight here?
Please do.
I
Please do.
think,
It's a good panel if there's a
I
food
think
fight.
it's wrong to think of agriculture as for us to set up agriculture as the only solution. I think what we're talking about are food systems. And food systems go beyond agriculture. Processing is part of it. The way for example, Switzerland doesn't have problems of iodine deficiency simply because of requiring iodization of table salt. And so when we talk about food systems, the focus and the locus of responsibility shifts beyond agriculture. And I think this is what Lucy and Richard will also emphasizing.
I'm very glad you brought that up. You know, I had studied agriculture, but it stops at the farm gate. Yet people that's a long way from the baby's mouth if that's what we're measuring as impact. And so I appreciate the start of that conversation. But to throw the food fight back, one of the questions I have really is, you know, through the ICN2 process and now even moving into the SDG process with the sunsetting of the MDGs, what is the role of the private sector in this, right? Because once food leaves the farm gate, and the more we've got urbanization going, people are going to be eating processed foods. And who owns that, right? The private sector owns a lot of the production of the foods that will be consumed by the undernourished. And so I'm wondering if maybe, Jomo, you might want to start with comments of where the private sector sits in all of this.
I think that the relations with the private sector were a huge challenge for the ICN2 process. I mean, just to give you some background, our major partners was the WHO, and WHO has very, very strict regulations in terms of dealing with the private sector, for good reason. I mean, the whole problem of the struggle over breastfeeding, infant formula, or over tobacco, and so on and so forth. So FAO has a much more open approach. So we had to find ways and means in which we could persuade our partners on how to engage in ways which did not compromise their principles. And we found quite a number of areas of agreement. For example, the whole question of food safety. There are huge problems, as many of you know, with aflatoxins in relation to peanuts as well as to maize in sub-Saharan Africa. And we have been talking to a number of companies which are involved, companies which might be quite objectionable for certain people, confectionery producing companies, but who agreed that they are collecting a great deal of data on where the fungus is to be found, and and this information, if shared. Now, these rival companies are not going to share the information with one another, but they're prepared to share it with a neutral party such as the FAO, and but we don't have the resources, and so a company which might take it upon itself, and in this case, I believe there's going to be a major arrangement between one of these confectionery companies and IBM to analyze that data. And in this manner, we can, working with the private sector, there's a lot of testing of food which needs to be done. The private sector has those facilities, and a whole other, just to take the aflatoxins example further, storage. If these farmers are individually not capable of developing storage facilities which will lend themselves to aflatoxin emergence, the companies could develop such storage facilities. So in this, there are ways, and this our WHO colleagues found quite unobjectionable, and we've identified a number of other areas. But I think it indicates that if we are serious about this, we can find ways and means without compromising principles, and nobody will accuse anybody of blue washing, for example, referring to the UN blue, and we can find ways of working with the private sector. So I think we are beginning to find creative new ways in which to engage, and this, I think, is a very major step forward. I just want to emphasize that this threatened to impede early settlement of the ICN2 outcome. The ICN2 was one of the few conferences in recent times in UN history. I've been with the UN system for the last decade, and it's the only conference where there was no divine intervention, and some people say the Pope had a role, but the only other conference where we had early settlement was involved the 2005 conference. Some of you may know, where there was Katrina. And it was Katrina which resulted in the 2005 conference actually having an early settlement because after following Katrina, over 800 bracketed items the brackets disappeared.